90-pound rucksack. Story of the 10th Mountain Division and the dawn of outdoor recreation in America. Episode 1, The Winter War. Welcome back to 90-pound rucksack. I'm your host, Christian Beckwith, and today we're going to be looking at how the 1939 Soviet invasion of Finland catalyzed the creation of the 10th Mountain Division, with little help from the National Ski Patrol System, the United States Army, and a couple of 20-something climbers from the American Alpine Club. More than 3% of the world's population dead. Millions of people around the world displaced from their homes. Much of Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa reduced to rubble. Some of the world's greatest cities, Berlin, Prague, Dresden, Tokyo, destroyed. The British and French empires, gone. Germany and Japan, conquered and occupied. An iron curtain separating West and East. The dawn of the nuclear age and the Cold War. The formation of NATO, the dissolution of the Old World, and the rise of the American century. World War II was the deadliest war in history, the most destructive war in history, the most expensive war in history. It grew out of the aftermath of World War I, the so-called Great War, when the victorious Allies, the United Kingdom, France, the United States, Japan, Italy, and more than 24 other nations, forced the defeated Central Powers, Imperial Germany, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, to sign the Treaty of Versailles. The accord required Germany to admit its role in starting the war, dissolve its military, relinquish its lands, and pay reparations to plunge the country deeper into financial ruin. Coupled with the economic depression that swept the world in the late 1920s, it paved the way for the political rise of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, an anti-Semitic, anti-communist, far-right nationalist group that would come to be known as the Nazis. Hitler harnessed the national sense of despondency precipitated by the Treaty of Versailles into an engine for his personal vision, one of a new racial order in Europe dominated by the German master race. To achieve it, he secretly began remilitarizing his country the moment he maneuvered his way to the position of Germany's chancellor in early 1933. His intentions were known to Britain and France, the continent's reigning powers, but exhausted by the privations of the Great War, they lacked the will to respond to German violations of the treaty with force, and instead adopted a policy of appeasement that greeted each new German transgression with toothless protests. The League of Nations, an international organization established in 1919 to keep world peace, was no help either. It proved as ineffective in countering Hitler's advances as it was Japan's growing military aggressions in Asia. On March 16, 1935, Hitler denounced the treaty's military clauses and began immediate general military conscription in Germany. The act was met on the continent with verbal protests and nothing more. On March 7, 1936, he sent more than 20,000 German troops into the Rhineland, a strip of western Germany that borders France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and that had been demilitarized by the treaty. Britain and France responded with hollow outrage. On October 23, 1936, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy signed a 9-point protocol in Berlin that formalized the two countries' alignment and cooperation. When Italian leader Benito Mussolini declared that all other European countries would thereafter rotate on the Rome-Berlin axis, the term Axis was born. On March 12, 1938, German troops marched into Austria, Hitler's country of birth, to annex the German-speaking and more or less willing nation on behalf of the Third Reich, successor, in Hitler's imaginings, to the earlier Holy Roman and German empires. As the tepid reaction to the annexation proved, the British and French governments were set on avoiding war at all costs. On September 30, 1938, under the banner of peace in our time, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Germany signed the Munich Agreement, which permitted the German annexation of the Sudetenland, the Czechoslovak borderland area where more than 3 million people, mainly ethnic Germans, lived. In doing so, it handed Hitler the keys to Nazi expansion. The Sudetenland held more than 66% of Czechoslovakia's coal, 70% of its iron and steel, and 70% of its electrical power. Without those resources, the Czech nation had no means to defend itself from German subjugation. Emboldened by the world's failure to act, on March 16, 1939, Germany cast aside the terms of the agreement and occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia. One of the philosophical cornerstones of Britain and France's policy of appeasement was the belief that a stronger Germany would help curb the spread of communism engendered by the Soviet Union, its mortal enemy. One can understand the world's surprise, then, when on August 23, 1939, the two countries signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, agreeing to take no military action against each other for the next 10 years. 1 week later, Germany invaded Poland. Britain, France, and other Commonwealth nations had no choice but to declare war, which they did on September 3rd. The Second World War had begun in Europe. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland. On October 6th, Germany and the Soviet Union divided and annexed the entire nation. And then, on November 30th, 1939, this happened.
There is warfare tonight between Russia and Finland. The Columbia Broadcasting System presents an analysis of these events by Elmer Davis.
The Russian attack on Finland seems to be regarded the world over as the most indefensible of all such actions that the totalitarian states have committed in recent years. The Vatican City newspaper speaks of a worldwide wave of indignation over Bolshevism's new aggressive policy, and from the dispatches we have received from all over Europe and from Washington as well, this seems to be no overstatement. Violent reaction to this in England and France and in the Scandinavian countries above all, where they are horrified by this attack on another Scandinavian country and uncertain if they may come next. Only the Germans content themselves with saying that Russia must have an outlet to the sea. And of course the communist explanation of this, as I have received it in a number of letters, is that this is not aggression, it is not imperialism, that the Russians, if they go into Finland, will be doing so only for the purpose of liberating Finland.
You'll be forgiven for drawing parallels between this invasion and the more recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. But 90-pound rucksack isn't about Russian invasions. It's about the 10th Mountain Division. Fast forward 5 years, 2 months, 2 weeks, and 5 days to February 18th, 1945, just below Italy's Riva Ridge, and the soldiers of the 10th would be assembling for a nighttime ascent that would go on to become the most famous military climb in history. On the day the Soviet Red Army invaded Finland, though, the division didn't even exist. To help us understand how the invasion paved the way for the 10th's formation, I reached out to the author of the Finnish-Soviet Winter War, Stalin's Hollow Victory.
I'm Dr. David Murphy. I'm a lecturer in military history and strategic studies based in Maynooth University, which is in Ireland.
The history of mountain warfare began, as one might expect, in the mountains of Europe. German, Austrian, French, Italian, and Swiss militaries all had mountain units in the First World War. And in the fall of 1939, as we'll soon learn, even the relatively tiny U.S. Army had begun planning its first large-scale winter maneuvers. The Soviet invasion of Finland, though, would highlight the importance of winter warfare capacities for armies around the world.
When you look at armies across Europe, they all have a kind of a baseline that they work from. And what's going to happen with World War II is they're going to have to train people to fight and survive in European conditions, but also desert, jungle, and then, oddly enough, Arctic conditions and mountain conditions. And that's where this impacts on 10th Mountain.
The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact the two countries had signed in August was known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact for the two foreign ministers, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov, who signed it. In addition to allowing Hitler and Stalin to pursue their respective agendas unimpeded, the pact contained a secret protocol. Russia had conquered Finland in 1809, and the country had been an autonomous Grand Duchy of Russia until it declared independence in 1917. Joseph Stalin wanted it back. Secretly, he wanted a buffer against Nazi Germany's expansion as well. The pact relegated Finland to the Soviet sphere of interest.
The war essentially opens with an air raid. There's no formal declaration of war per se. Russian planes show up over Helsinki on the morning of the 30th, and they bomb the railway station during rush hour. All of this, people following the war in Ukraine will notice similarities here. And then Russian forces started to pour across the border at 4 significant points between them and Finland. And essentially the Russians have this plan that the war is all going to be over by December, by Stalin's birthday in December, they're planning on a 3 or 4 week kind of deal. They have the victory parade planned. They have a date and all in their head. So when the Russians go forward within their groups, they have army bands, brass bands, with kind of like, drums and trumpets and trombones and boo, boo, boo. The whole thing. They have the whole shebang. But it all goes off the rails because the Finns show a much smaller army, but the Finns show themselves being capable of doing winter warfare.
Stalin had a reason to be optimistic. Russia's population in 1939 was 170 million. Finland's was barely more than 3.5 million. Russian soldiers had all the artillery the Red Army could muster. The Finns had some light machine guns, some heavy machine guns, and some anti-tank weapons, almost all of which dated to the First World War.
In terms of numbers, in the entire course of the war, the Finns can kind of put about 350,000 in the field. The first wave of the Russians is 460,000. Then they big that up to over 700,000, something like 720. And by the end of the war, they've got 1-point-something million committed to this. And also the disparities in equipment. The Russians go in with just one stat, tanks, 6,500 tanks. 6,500 tanks. They commit to this operation. The Finns have 38 tanks. And then when you look at aircraft again, like the Finns have operational about 85 aircraft, and the Russians are committing 3,000 aircraft to this. And everybody's kind of like looking at this poor, brave little Finland, but this is all going to be over in 2 weeks. David and Goliath.
The Russian army, which was 1.8 million soldiers strong, included Siberian troops who knew how to fight in Arctic conditions. Those soldiers weren't sent to Finland.
The guys they use for the Finnish operation essentially are city dwellers in around the Leningrad military district. So they're conscripted in, recruited in. They're not outdoors kind of people. Okay, they're city people. Very basic military training, very basic kit, no winter camouflage, no proper tactical training. The officers in this tend to be quite poor as well. And then when you think as well in this period in time, and they've just gone through what are known as the purges, the Great Purges, and that has particularly hit the army. Various officers that Stalin was displeased with ended up in front of show trials, ended up executed. So they've actually taken out their best leaders, their top-tier leadership. So they're really crippled by some of their practices.
The Finns were also aided by the fact that their entire population, male and female, urban and rural inhabitants alike, embraced recreation, in winter as in all months.
The Finns like the outdoors. They like cross-country skiing. They like hunting. So they can all shoot. They can all go out and camp in the woods and survive. They can use snowshoes. They can use skis. They can move around. They can go out for days and this is just in their pastime. The weather does not seem to be ever bad enough to stop them going outside. Okay, so they go out, they exist, they have fun in minus 30 degrees centigrade. And then if you factor that in, it just means they can live and survive, where the Soviet troops, as this goes on, are really struggling.
That struggle was amplified by the Finnish topography. Finland's forested landscape is riddled with lakes and rivers, ideal for hunting, cross-country skiing, and skating, but not for advancing columns of Russian tanks.
It's heavily forested the more you go into the north. A lot of the roads going through the forests are single vehicle wide. Okay, single vehicle wide. The forest comes right to the edge of the road. So the Russians are kind of like long columns going into these deep winter forests.
Many of the Finns fighting in these forests had been activated as reserves. They were given bolt-action rifles and a national badge on their hats to identify them, but otherwise outfitted themselves. This was in some ways to their advantage. As any mountaineer will tell you, it's better to use your own gear, equipment you know and trust, than to be forced to use kit that's unfamiliar. They had something else the Russians didn't have: camo. Their clothing, including hats and shoe mitts, were white. They painted their tanks, artillery, and equipment white as well. In a winter landscape, that made a critical difference.
The Finns will have basically a 2-piece white overall set. Okay, so they can hood up. They've white gloves, they can hood up, and their snipers as well will use a white face mask. So essentially, this is abominable snowman kind of stuff. You've got somebody moving around who from head to, in a white landscape, is dressed in white from head to foot. The Russians are going around in their standard uniform, which is kind of like a dark greyish. Their tanks, they don't even paint their tanks white at the initial phase of this campaign. So the tanks go in kind of like grey or green into a wintered landscape, so you can spot them a mile away.
The invasion began when the land, the lakes, and the rivers were frozen.
You decided to start this at 30th of November, so you're heading into the Arctic winter. Temperatures will get down to 40 minus Celsius. And then when you go right to the far north, which is a theatre of operations, they go into Arctic winter, so it's permanent darkness, almost permanent darkness. And that's where the Soviets are trying to operate and operate air power and operate tanks in. The terrain and the weather are also force multipliers for the Finns. And because they can survive and operate, and the Russians can't, initially for the first 2 or 3 months of this war, they will have the upper hand.
The Russians lumbered into the frozen Finnish forests in their mechanized green columns, sticking to the narrow roads. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. Skating along the lakes and rivers, or skiing up through the trees, the camouflaged Finns would attack and then disappear back into the woods. The Russians couldn't synchronize their artillery onto their positions because the Finns didn't stop moving until they were hidden. If the Russians tried to pursue them onto the lakes, the Finns would blow them up and drown them. A particularly effective Finnish tactic was to stop the advance of a long, drawn-out Russian column with a roadblock, break the column into smaller parts, and then destroy it, bit by bit. One such incident took place along a narrow road in the middle of the country in early January.
There's one particular incident it's in that middle section, an area known as the Rat Road, R-A-A-T-E. And essentially they find 2 Russian divisions, nose to tail, going in a long column through the woods, heading in towards the centre of Finland. So they just essentially messed that up. I need to use bad words there. But they build a roadblock at the front. So they stop the head of the column, and then parties of Finns will ski up to the sides of the column, get out onto the road and break it down into what they call motti, smaller chunks. They break it up, they build more roadblocks. So this big one long column becomes 20 or 30 smaller groups, and they keep those guys pinned down, and then gradually they just destroy each one in turn. The guts of 20,000 troops, you break them down into groups of 200-300 that you can deal with individually, give them a bit of individual attention. And those 2 divisions essentially just disappear along that road. And they repeat that in a couple of different places along the border. Now, for the guys enduring that, for the Russian guys in that, it's an absolute nightmarish kind of scenario. And there's all this kind of like psychological stuff that goes into that too. That the Finns would take frozen Russian bodies and prop them up and use them as signposts with kind of like, Helsinki this way. And just basically deriding the Russians. And then also, I mean, when you think about this, kind of how stressful this must have been. So imagine you're in a Russian column, night falls, you post sentries and you go to sleep. And the next day you come back, all your sentries have been killed. A Russian officer talks about this. He posts all the sentries around his position. He says, that's it, basically, I'm cool, this is good for the night. The guys are going to keep an eye out. And the next morning he goes out and he finds that the Finns have come in the night, and silently, with the little puukko knife, they've killed all the sentries. Killed them all. They're all there, dead. Okay, so that's worrying. So next night he posts double sentries or whatever to try and keep the perimeter secure. The next morning the sentries are okay. Okay, they're okay, but the Finns have bypassed the sentries, got into the camp, killed a load of guys in their beds or in their sleeping bags or whatever they're bedded down in, and gone back out. And taken stuff, like they'll come in and do that. And they'll take your heavy machine gun and they'll head off with that and this kind of stuff. So, psychologically, that's just destroying, isn't it, really? You're operating in cold and dark and hungry against these people who, quite often, the Soviets will refer to them as ghosts. Like occasionally they're a shadow moving in the trees, but you never get to grips with them. So it's, psychologically, it's not good.
The Finns added other innovations to the bag of tricks. One of them was the Molotov cocktail, named for the Russian foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, who had signed the non-aggression pact with Germany and who had declared on Soviet radio that the incendiary bombing missions over Finland were actually airborne humanitarian food deliveries of bread. The Finns' Molotov cocktail was thus a drink to go with Molotov's food.
The Molotov cocktail, my favorite cocktail. The Molotov cocktails have been around. They actually they show up in the Spanish Civil War, which is mid-30s, but they're not called Molotovs. Molotov, the person, is the Russian foreign minister. who the Finns hold in absolute disdain because he's talking peace and spinning them lies, and the next thing there's bombs being dropped on them. So he's particularly identified, and that's why his name's applied to this. It's so simple. It's not a full bottle, half a bottle of petrol, 3/4 of a bottle of petrol. If you can get it, put sugar into it as well. I probably shouldn't be repeating these methodologies. But it's a petrol bomb. It's a modular petrol bomb. And they find these are very, very effective against Russian armor. But also, there are a couple of occasions where it gets into town fighting, and they will throw those from rooftops as well. So very, very, very simple. Very easy to make. The Finns also develop one that has a contact detonator pencil on it. So you don't even have to do the lighted rag thing. It's all sealed, but it'll explode on impact. For anti-tank work, that's really excellent.
There's something else to remember from the Winter War as well. The most successful sniper in military history.
Hey-ha, Seymour Hey-ha, Seymour Hey-ha. The White Death, as he was known, is a woodsman, is a huntsman. Knows how to shoot, and he's shooting for the pots, so he knows how to place around. He's working, he's living outdoors. I think he's done his national service, so he's chalked in the Army Reserve, and then he's activated for this war, and he's just a natural sniper. He very good marksmanship skills. He's not using a scoped rifle. It is an open sights, it's an iron sights rifle. He sometimes uses an SMG when he gets up really, really close. The Sumi submachine gun. Basically, he's a very good shot, but he's very good at stalking in very, very close. But he has his white camo suit. He has a face cloth as well. But it's snowshoeing and it's skiing, and he like one of his specialities as well is kind of like infiltrating into columns or into the back of columns, and then picking up the guys at the end. Taking out the guys at the end. So the Russians are moving in a certain direction. Their focus is ahead, as you would be in that kind of situation. They're not minding what's going on behind. So there's no rear security, and he's gradually moving up the column, taking out people on the column from behind. So it's all nightmarish if you're Russian, very clever if you're Finnish. So depending on whose account you want to believe, you might be looking at 500 or so kills in the course of the war for him personally. Maybe less, but in around 500. So he is officially the world's deadliest ever sniper.
Finns like Ea would do anything to protect their land. When the Russians started invading, soldiers and civilians alike employed a scorched earth strategy, killing their own livestock and laying waste to the countryside until there wasn't so much as an outhouse for the Russians to shelter in. This exacerbated problems for the Russian soldiers, who lacked the proper clothing for the Arctic winter. They began to freeze to death. Then the Finns started targeting the Russian field kitchens. If a field kitchen got taken out, nobody ate. Soon the Russians were not only dying of cold, they were starving. Unlike the Russians, the Finns knew how to take care of their troops. They operated in small units, and every company had the ability to provide its soldiers with a hot meal and a hot drink and a rest in a heated area. In some cases, the Finns built ad hoc saunas, so their troops could not only keep warm, they could enjoy the comfort of the national obsession at the end of a long, hard day of killing Russians. It all added up.
Russian records and Russian propaganda make it impossible to get a final line on the casualties in this. But you're looking at a couple of 100,000 dead. Okay, look, a couple of 100,000 dead. The Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s said it was 1 million dead that we lost. Sometimes these guys are still being found in the woods. They're still finding them, or what's left of them.
But even with snipers like Ea and Molotov cocktails and an intimate understanding of the terrain and how to navigate it, the Finns could only hold off the might of the Red Army for so long.
It's one of those stories that kind of builds you up and gives you hope. And I was actually talking in class about it today. You always want to stop off. So you want to stop this story somewhere around New Year's Day, 1940. But essentially what happens in kind of like January, February, the Russians get their act together. They bring in fresh troops, okay? And amongst those, there are Siberian troops, okay? So there are guys who can actually live in the minus 40 conditions, no problem. They equip them better. They kind of like do better air-ground coordination, better artillery coordination, better coordination with their tanks, proper infantry support for their tanks. Key in all this, there's a Russian general called Semyon Timoshenko. Timoshenko will be one of the big Russian generals of World War II. He's one of the more senior and more significant ones. Very good organizer, basically whips everything into a shape. He actually builds areas for them to rehearse their attacks, okay? They're planning these attacks in the Mannerheim line. He builds a fake Mannerheim line, so his guys can do dress rehearsals. So then what happens is then kind of like February, they start upping up the pressure on the Finns. Breakthrough at Mannerheim. And once they've done that, they can kind of like, basically head up the road, start heading west, and they're heading towards Helsinki. So essentially that forces the Finns into a peace treaty, and the war ends 13th of March as a Russian victory. I mean, it's an interesting period because if you think of the history of World War II, Poland has been invaded in September of 39. So we have a world war going on in Europe, technically. Okay, the Germans have gone into Poland. 17th of September, the Russians take over the second part of Poland, and that essentially triggers World War II. But what is actually happening, France and Britain are at war with Germany. Britain has a force in Belgium, and that period is usually referred to as the phony war or Sitzkrieg. Like there's nothing happening. It's it will not kick off again really in the European context till May of 1940. So what we find is there's a lot of journalists trying to cover the war in Europe that isn't actually happening. And then all of a sudden you've got a reasonably serious shooting war going on up in the Nordic country. They relocate up to Finland to cover this war. And all of a sudden that starts showing up in regular newspapers like, Washington Post, New York Times. It starts hitting the newspapers. There's some cine footage as well that starts being recorded. Nobody probably will remember this, but when people go to the cinema, there will be a newsreel telling you what's happening in the war. So all of a sudden, for global and for American audiences, they go to the cinema at the weekend and they get the 20-minute newsreel at the start, and all of a sudden here they're seeing the Winter War, 5 or 10 minutes of the Winter War. The whole world is watching this, and everybody's fascinated as how are the Finns actually doing this. So on the far side of that, when we get into 1940 and, people start unpacking this, everybody suddenly realizes that actually, we're going to be fighting in these conditions. Probably this is the way the future of war is going. There's going to be, work in the high Arctic. There's going to be mountain warfare. So everybody, all the major armies start kind of reconfigure how they're going to do that. And that's where, in terms of the 10th Mountain, it goes from being an idea into being a reality.
And this is where the prevailing narrative about the 10th's origin story begins. And it most often begins with a voluble, bespectacled skier who in 1938 had helped put together the country's first ski rescue organization, the National Ski Patrol System. His name, Charles Minot Dole. We're telling the story of the 10th with the help of an advisory board of the division's foremost experts. McKay Jenkins is one of them. Jenkins is the Cornelius Tillman Professor of English, Journalism, and Environmental Humanities at the University of Delaware, and the author of, among many other books, The Last Ridge, the epic story of the U.S. Army's 10th Mountain Division and the assault on Hitler's Europe. I've asked him to tell us about the man commonly credited with the division's formation, a man known universally as Minnie Dole.
Minnie Dole was like a classic blue blood New Englander. He was a graduate of Phillips Andover Academy, which is a very blue blood old prep school. He then went to Yale, where he was a Whiff and Poof, which is one of the famous a cappella groups. And he was such a good singer that he was actually offered a professional singing contract. He turned it down, and that position was given to Rudy Valley, who went on to become a very famous crooner. So Minnie Dole came from a very, very solid, New England establishment family, New England establishment universities. And by virtue of that, he was plugged into a lot of what we would now call kind of old boy networks. Like he knew people in politics, he knew people in business, he knew people, in his case, in skiing.
In February 1940, an après-ski gathering of 4 friends, Minnie Dole, Roger Langley, Robert Livermore, and Alex Bright, took place at an inn in Vermont. Some assert the meeting's location was Manchester's Orvis Inn. Others argue it happened at Johnny Seesaw's Inn, near the small town of Peru, after a race on Bromley Mountain. Still others suggest that the conversation began at Johnny Seesaw's and then continued later that evening at the Orvis Inn, where the men were likely lodging. What is beyond dispute is that the 4 friends were emblematic of the well-educated, well-connected men at the forefront of the nascent sport, which had somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million active practitioners. Livermore and Bright had been members of the 1936 Olympic ski team. Langley was the president of the National Ski Association. 2 years earlier, he and Dole had conceived of the National Ski Patrol System as a response to the growing number of accidents on the slopes. The ascot-wearing Dole was now its director. You can almost hear the sound of the logs crackling and smell the pipe tobacco as Minnie and his mates discuss the Finns' ongoing actions against the backdrop of the growing hostilities in Europe.
Reason this came up is that there were newsreels in movie houses all across the country that were showing black and white news footage of Soviet tanks moving through the icy Finnish countryside, and then Finnish skiers across, I should note importantly, cross-country skiers. This is something we can talk about later, but Finnish soldiers on cross-country skis, or even at times on ice skates, skiing or skating through the Finnish forests and launching things like Molotov cocktails, or even something as simple as like taking a big stick and jamming it into the treads of Soviet tanks, disabling the tanks, or shooting the Russian or Soviet soldiers and then disappearing into the woods. And I've always thought that American moviegoers would have seen that imagery and thought to themselves, this is what the American Revolution might have looked like. You know, a bunch of ragtag American soldiers fighting the British in the woods, you know, coming in, sniping, disappearing. Meanwhile, the British are marching in lockstep down the road and getting picked off. These guys were not mountaineers, they were skiers. So they thought, what we can contribute to this is a big network of people, because they had already organized the National Ski Patrol at all the ski resorts in New England. And they also had this ski patrol rescue training, and they knew everybody that was doing this. They start working their networks of people, trying to get into the War Department, trying to get an audience with the Secretary of War, with the Army Chief of Staff, trying to lobby for the creation of something brand new.
A quick but important aside, one we'll circle back to shortly. In 1939, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army was General George C. Marshall, a brilliant military tactician who would soon go on to oversee the largest military expansion in U.S. history. The Secretary of War was Harry Woodring, a strict non-interventionist who was opposed to American entry into the war. This so irritated President Franklin Delano Roosevelt that he appointed an outspoken interventionist, Lewis Johnson, as Woodring's assistant. Quickly at odds, Woodring and Johnson soon refused to speak to one another. On June 20th, 1940, Roosevelt would put an end to the matter by firing Woodring and replacing him with Henry Stimson, a longtime American statesman and Republican politician who had served as Secretary of War under President William Taft and Secretary of State under President Herbert Hoover.
And this is worth listeners thinking about, because these were civilians proposing a radical new set of American soldiers at a time when war was right on the horizon. It was a very brash thing to do. These were not, military advisors. These were civilian skiers. So the first response from a lot of the military senior staff was to be, grateful for their patriotism, and they sort of patted them on the head and said, "Thanks for your eccentric idea, but we got this."
There was a reason for the military's lukewarm response. In 1940, America's entire military consisted of fewer than 200,000 soldiers. Developing a specialized and unprecedented mountain warfare unit, especially one composed of civilian skiers and climbers, was a tough sell, particularly when the Army needed to ramp up its overall numbers ASAP.
But Minnie Dole was really kind of relentless in his lobbying, and he and several of his colleagues kept on pounding the pavement, writing letters to Henry Stimson and writing letters to George Marshall and trying to get an audience. And over time, they wore down, I guess you could say, the resistance in the military establishment. And finally, in I think it was October of 1941, Henry Stimson and George Marshall agreed to formulate something known as the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment. And a couple of weeks later, November 15th, that unit was formed. And then 3 weeks later, Pearl Harbor happened and the United States entered the war. And suddenly it's game time. So what's interesting about this as it evolved is once Japan was involved, that opened up the other vulnerable point for the United States, which on the West Coast meant the Aleutian Islands. The fear was that if the Japanese were to invade the United States, they would probably hop across the Aleutian Islands, come in through Alaska, and come in down to continental United States. And you can see the parallel here. So in both cases, the Russians or the Germans coming from the northeast or the Japanese coming from the northwest, both entry points were northern and cold environments. And so, soldiers trained in Texas were not going to be a whole lot of use up in those particular places. So suddenly this wacky idea of having skiers and mountaineers come in and train a new group of soldiers started to make a lot of sense. And that's how this thing got started.
America's mountain fighting inadequacies might have been alarming to civilians such as Minnie Dole and his friends, but they were a vital threat to the United States Army, one that General Marshall took seriously. Marshall had been studying the country's readiness for mountain warfare prior to the Soviet invasion of Finland. In its aftermath, he assigned 2 key members of his team, Lieutenant Colonels Nelson M. Walker and Charles E. Hurtis, to study the topic more thoroughly. When Walker met with Dole in the fall of 1940 to discuss a mountain unit, his support and that of Hurtis became key to its formation. As an essay in the 1946 American Alpine Journal War Edition noted, "To these officers, great credit is due for their part in organizing the 1st Mountain Regiment and encouraging the War Department to continue to give direct aid to mountain training." This is not to say that America's winter warfare experiences were non-existent before the 1939 invasion. As early as the winter of 1775-76, during the Revolutionary War, American soldiers used skis, snowshoes, and sleds to move cannons over the snowy New England hills. And from 1886 to 1918, U.S. Army troops used skis to patrol Yellowstone National Park in winter to keep poachers at bay. But it wasn't until the 1918 deployment of U.S. troops to aid the White Russians during the Russian Civil War that a U.S. Army unit received its first real winter warfare training in what came to be known as the Polar Bear Expedition. In September 1918, in response to requests from the governments of Great Britain and France, President Woodrow Wilson sent a contingent of some 5,000 troops from the 339th Infantry Regiment to fight the Red Army. The unit received nominal winter training in England before continuing to the Archangel-Murmansk area of northern Russia, where it fought through the bitter cold of the Russian winter, using skis, snowshoes, and sleds to maneuver through the deep snow. Upon the regiment's return to the U.S. in the summer of 1919, much of its equipment was transferred to Minnesota's Fort Snelling, one of the small 19th century outposts being used to guard the country's northern border with Canada. Many of the few hundred soldiers stationed in Fort Snelling were from America's northern latitudes. Accustomed to harsh conditions, they knew how to make the most of the winter months, and for the next 20 years, equipment from the Polar Bear Expedition was used sparingly by these soldiers for training in winter warfare, and more frequently for recreational outings. In the fall of 1939, the Army began to plan its first large-scale winter maneuvers, drawing soldiers of the 28th Infantry Regiment from 2 border outposts, New York State's Pine Camp and Lake Placid. The Soviet invasion of Finland gave the winter maneuvers a new sense of urgency, especially once the success of the Finns against the heavily mechanized Soviet forces caught the world's attention. These maneuvers were not without their hiccups. Unfamiliar with the nuances of skiing, for example, organizers purchased skis without realizing that they needed to buy bindings to go with them. But from January through March 1940, at both Pine Camp and, to a smaller extent, at Lake Placid, New York, some 1,000 soldiers donned white camouflage and practiced their maneuvers on skis, snowshoes, and with toboggans, a training the Army declared a notable success, as well as a potential template for future exercises. Who gave the directive for augmenting America's cold weather capabilities with the maneuvers? The most logical suspect is the military's highest-ranking officer, Chief of Staff General Marshall. The Army was aware of the need to train soldiers in the art of winter warfare, and General Marshall had a history of big-picture thinking that would prove pivotal to American victory in the war. Not only would he oversee an expansion of the military from the world's 17th largest army, just behind that of Romania, to the most effective, best-equipped fighting force in history, he would lay the groundwork for the creation of America's first armored, airborne, as well as mountain divisions, none of which existed before the war. But what sparked General Marshall's initial consideration of a mountain troop? And when did that inspiration occur? For the purposes of our story, The most important point about the Pine Camp maneuvers is the date. Planning for them began in the fall of 1939, before the Soviet invasion of Finland, and long before Minnie Dole's 1940 gathering in Vermont. And this is where we enter a story about the 10th Mountain Division's formation that history has forgotten. And it's a story that begins not with skiers or the Army, but with climbers from the American Alpine Club. The AAC had been founded as an alpine society in 1902 by the Hungarian-born geologist, naturalist, and explorer, Angelo Helprin. 37 years later, in 1939, it boasted 11 honorary and 242 dues-paying members, including many of the country's most prominent mountaineers. As with the leadership of America's burgeoning ski community, the AAC's ranks were populated by affluent members of society. Among them were a group of 20-something Wunderkinds known as the Harvard Five. This group, which included Hubert Adams Carter, Robert Hicks Bates, Bradford Washburn, Charlie Houston, and Terry Moore, had helped advance the standards of American mountaineering in the 1930s. Carter and Bates would go on to play instrumental roles in the tent's development, and Carter, as editor of the American Alpine Journal, would become the foremost chronicler of world mountaineering. In 1939, Ad, as he was known to his friends, was 25 years old and already had a number of significant climbs to his credit. A New Englander, he had made his first ascent of Mount Washington at the age of 5. 15 years later, while studying at Harvard, he had made a remarkable first ascent of Alaska's Mount Crillon with fellow student Bradford Washburn. In 1936, at age 22, Ad had helped plan the British-American Himalayan expedition to India's 7,816-meter Nanda Devi from his Harvard dorm room. The expedition was successful, and Nanda Devi remained the highest mountain ever climbed until 1950. Ad was also an expert skier and had competed in the 1937 Alpine World Skiing Championships and the 1938 Pan American Championships as a member of the United States ski team. A rumpled, deeply amiable Quaker with a profound interest in the human condition, Ad was also a polyglot. When he was 15, he lived for a year with Switzerland's most respected guiding family, the Ogis, with whom he'd learned to both climb and speak German like a local. He was also fluent in French, Italian, and Spanish, and he'd learned Balti with his porters on the approach to Nanda Devi. Bob Bates was 3 years Ad's senior, a joyful, intelligent, self-effacing man with a guttural laugh and twinkling eyes. Slight, short, and skinny, he'd attended Harvard from 1929 to 1935, where, like Ad, he was a member of the Harvard Mountaineering Club. In 1937, Bates and Bradford Washburn had made the first ascent of the highest unclimbed mountain in North America, the Yukon's Mount Lucania, a climb that ended with a mapless 100-mile trek back to civilization through the wilderness. In 1938, on an expedition put together by Charlie Houston, Bates attempted the world's second highest mountain, the 8,611-meter K2. On that trip, Teton pioneer Paul Petzl, who we'll meet later in this podcast, reached a height of 8,100 meters, higher than anyone else had ever climbed. In the summer of 1939, Bates traveled to Switzerland to join Ad on a climbing trip. Traveling to Europe at the end of the Great Depression to do something as frivolous as climbing is an activity that only a few could enjoy, a topic we'll tackle in the next episode when we look at the state of outdoor recreation in America before the war. For now, though, we'll simply quote from Bates' memoir, "The Love of Mountains is Best." At Mountain Huts, it was not easy to get world news, but we did learn from hut keepers that war was appearing more likely between Germany and Poland. The Germans were getting very aggressive, and almost all the Swiss we met were apprehensive. We saw Swiss mountain troops maneuvering, and we talked about how the U.S. Army could make good use of mountain troops too. As we learned earlier in this episode, President Roosevelt replaced the isolationist Secretary of War, Henry Woodring, with the interventionist Henry Stimson in June of 1940. What we haven't yet mentioned was the fact that Stimson was also a climber, and a former and future honorary member of the American Alpine Club, of which both Carter and Bates were members in very good standing. Morris Sisserman is a climbing historian and professor of American history at Hamilton College. He's written a history of America's mountain troops entitled The Winter Army, the World War II Odyssey of the 10th Mountain Division, America's Elite Alpine Warriors, He's also written a history of Himalayan mountaineering entitled Fallen Giants. In it, he writes, Carter and Bates lobbied both U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson and U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall on the need for mountain troops. I've asked Professor Isman to help us understand how his research led him to Carter and Bates' lobbying efforts, and how those efforts contributed to the creation of the 10th Mountain Division.
I'm not a military historian by training. I haven't written any other military history. But in writing about the history of mountaineering in general, and American mountaineering in particular, I kept running into the 10th Mountain Division. I wrote a book called Fallen Giants, A History of Himalayan Mountaineering. And I ran into a number of characters like Bob Bates and Ad Carter, associated with the American Alpine Club, who in the 1930s were pioneers in American ventures into the Himalaya. And they both had connections with the creation of the 10th Mountain Division. And again, writing Continental Divide, my history of American mountaineering, I ran into lots of ways in which climbers coming out of the American Alpine Club, the Sierra Club, and a few other places, contributed to the creation of the 10th Mountain Division. So I sort of backed into writing this military history about the first American Alpine fighting unit.
And so when you were researching Fallen Giants, I see that you gave credit to H. Adams Carter and Bob Bates in their lobbying efforts with the U.S. Army to create a division. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the standard story, and it's not untrue, is that a guy named Charles Minot Dole, or Minnie Dole, who was a founder of the National Ski Patrol and an avid and very good amateur skier, along with several friends of his, came up with the idea for the 10th Mountain Division after a long day's skiing one day in February of 1940. That is, before the United States was a belligerent, but when the Second World War was already about 6 months old. And they were thinking that, eventually the United States was going to get involved. And given that potential enemies like Germany and Italy had a well-developed tradition of mountain troops, given that their national borders fell on the Alps, the United States should think about doing the same. And the National Ski Patrol was undoubtedly very important in the creation of the 10th Mountain Division. But there was another side of that story, and that involved the climbing community, which at the time, in the 1930s, was quite small, centered in the American Alpine Club, in the rock climbing section of the Sierra Club, in some corners of the Appalachian Mountain Club, and a few other climbing groups, a few university groups. And out of that community came some pretty vital contributions to, first of all, the idea of creating mountain troops, but secondly, to figuring out what they were going to need to do the job in terms of gear, in terms of clothing, in terms of technique.
And can you talk to the actual inception? So we've got this moment that Bob Bates documents in his memoir about being in Switzerland with Ad Carter and observing the maneuvers of the Swiss mountain troops and saying, we need to talk to somebody in the War Department about this.
Yeah, this is late summer of 1939, and the Second World War begins on September 1st. And they're in Switzerland, and Switzerland, of course, another place with a long tradition of mountain troops, and they managed to remain neutral in the Second World War. But they're there when the Swiss Army is on maneuvers, and they observe them as they're doing their own climbing, and kind of look at each other and think, if a war is coming, and if the United States gets involved in this war, we're going to need some of those ourselves. And the chronology is not entirely clear about when they began to share this idea, but sometime 1939, 1940, they do begin to reach out to influential people, some of them in the War Department, to bring this idea to the fore. And their efforts are parallel to, and at the same time as, those that Minnie Dole and his friends from the National Ski Patrol, skiing community are making similar suggestions.
John Embry, an American paleoceanographer who served with the 10th during its deployment to Italy, begins his chronology of the division with an entry about an exchange between General Marshall and Lewis Johnson, who, as you'll remember, was the interventionist appointed by President Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of War to counterbalance Henry Woodring. The entry reads, January 6, 1940. Lewis Johnson asked Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall what consideration has been given to special clothing, equipment, food, transportation, and other essentials necessary to field an effective force under conditions like those of the campaigns in Finland. General Marshall replies that winter warfare was always important to the Alaskan Command, and that for several years, winter exercises have been conducted by troops at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, and elsewhere. He adds that winter maneuvers on a larger scale than yet attempted are desirable, but to date, money for this purpose has not been available. Embry's second entry is marked May 1940. It reads, The American Alpine Club urges the War Department to introduce mountain warfare training in the U.S. Army. The third entry in Embry's chronology is dated July 18, 1940. Charles Minot Dole, chairman of the National Ski Patrol Committee, writes a letter to President Roosevelt offering to recruit experienced skiers to help train troops in ski patrol work. So, who planted the seed for cold weather and mountain warfare with General Marshall? The American Alpine Club or Minnie Dole? You may well have the answer to this riddle, and if so, I encourage you to reach out and share it so that we may shed yet more light on the 10th's origin story, for it has evaded my research as well as that of our advisory board. And for your consideration, I offer my bias. Not only am I a climber and ski mountaineer, I'm a devoted fan of H. Adams Carter and Bob Bates. When Ad passed away in 1996, I took over the editorial duties of the American Alpine Journal, the publication that he had transformed over the course of 36 years into the premier chronicle of world mountaineering. Bob Bates and his Harvard Five friends Bradford Washburn and Charlie Houston took an interest in my tutelage, concerned, no doubt, that I would inadvertently wreck their dear friend's legacy. Those men were gentlemen of the first order, humble and kind, and they applied their prodigious skills and energies to improving not only my efforts, but the world around them, however and wherever they could. When I read in Bates' memoir that he and Ad had observed the maneuvers of the Swiss mountain troops in the summer of 1939, and talked about how the U.S. Army could make good use of mountain troops of their own, I became convinced that they'd gotten the ball rolling on what would become the 10th Mountain Division months before anyone else. I wanted it to be them, but I cannot substantiate the assertion that it was. I've spent weeks going through the American Alpine Club board minutes in an attempt to verify Embry's May 1940 entry about the AAC, without success. I've tracked down Henry Stimson's correspondences at Yale and reviewed the letters of AAC officials in 1939 and 1940, but similarly found no smoking guns that point to the organization's role in a lobbying campaign that predated that of Minnie Dole and their National Ski Patrol System. None of our advisory board members are able to pinpoint the exact catalyst for the division either. Most significant discoveries are made independently and more or less simultaneously by multiple people. The same could be said for the realization that the U.S. might soon be engaged in cold weather and mountain warfare, and that unlike the Finnish guerrillas, it was woefully unprepared to do so. In the end, the 10th Mountain Division's genesis lay not solely with Minnie Dole and the National Ski Patrol System, nor with General Marshall and the U.S. Army, nor with H. Adams Carter, Bob Bates, and the American Alpine Club, but in a simultaneous convergence of all three forces, advocating for the unprecedented development of America's very first mountain troops. As the saying goes, you can get a lot done as long as you're not concerned about who gets the credit. And in the case of the 10th, the credit goes to all three. And that concludes episode 1 of 90 Pound Rucksack. Thank you for listening. If you like this episode, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and please share it. Tell a friend about it and give it 5 stars on your app. If you want to learn more about the podcast's genesis, check out episode 0 on christianbeckwith.com, and stay tuned for episode 2, in which we explore the history of mountain troops in Europe before World War II, the state of outdoor recreation in America before the war, and how the rise of the Third Reich caused some of the best German and Austro-Hungarian mountaineers to flee Europe for America, influencing climbing and skiing on this side of the Atlantic and contributing to the fighting skills of America's 1st Mountain Division. If you have stories about the mountain troops you want to share, reach out and let me know. I'll share them on my website, christianbeckwith.com, and include the best of them in the newsletter and in interviews on the podcast. Sign up for the newsletter for info on upcoming episodes, and if you're really into the story of the 10th, please consider becoming a patron. Patrons get unabridged episodes as well as behind-the-scenes content available only to them. Special thanks go out to our advisory board members, McKay Jenkins, Chris Jurgens, Jeff Leik, David Little, Sepp Scanlon, Kelly Schmidt, and Doug Schmidt for their help with this podcast, as well as Professors David Murphy and Morris Isserman for their contributions. And props to Roman Dushenko for his help in putting this episode together. Until next time, thanks for joining, and I hope you get outside and do something wild today. Remember, climbing and ski mountaineering are dangerous, but without risk, there is no adventure. Have fun, stay safe, and stay in touch.